Aurora woke up to the sterile scent of disinfectant and something faintly metallic. Blood, maybe. The ceiling above her was an off-white, cracked in places, the fluorescent light flickering at uneven intervals. Her head throbbed. Her body felt heavy, as if she'd been asleep for days. She turned her head slowly. The room was small, clinical, empty, except for the metal frame bed she lay in and a chair in the corner, where a man in a white coat sat, flipping through a thin folder. "You're awake," the man said, looking up. He had sharp, analytical eyes, framed by round glasses. "How are you feeling?" Aurora tried to speak, but her throat was dry. She swallowed, then tried again. "Where am I?" "The St. Dymphna Psychiatric Hospital," he answered. "You were brought here 2 nights ago. Do you remember how?" She shook her head, and for a brief moment, panic squeezed her chest. She tried to summon a memory, anything, but her mind was a foggy void. "What's your name?" he asked, watching her closely. She hesitated. She knew it. It was Aurora, she said, suddenly sure. "Aurora. I don't know my last name." The man nodded, as if he had expected that. "I'm Dr. Lenhart. You were found wandering the outskirts of town, disoriented. No ID, no records matching your description. Do you recall anything from before you arrived here?" Aurora shut her eyes and tried. Flashes of something dark. A long hallway, a door marked 13. The feeling of being watched. But it was like grasping at mist. The images slipped away before she could hold on to them. "No," she admitted. Dr. Lenhart sighed, jotting something down. "That's okay. Amnesia, especially dissociative amnesia, is often triggered by trauma. Given time, your memories may return naturally." A noise outside the room made Aurora turn her head. The hallway was lined with dim, yellowing lights. Several patients in loose hospital gowns shuffled along. One of them, a young man with hollow cheeks and dark circles under his eyes, stopped in the doorway and stared at her. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured. His voice was barely above a whisper, but Aurora felt it inside her, like the distant hum of something old and waiting. Before she could ask him what he meant, an orderly gently guided him away. Dr. Lenhart didn't seem concerned. "The patients here tend to fixate on certain ideas. Don't let it worry you." But it did, and when she glanced into the dim hallway once more, she saw it, a black number scrawled onto the wall near the far end. But Imundravda, Aurora barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she found herself in a long, dimly lit hallway. The air was thick with dust, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed above her. The walls were lined with doors, each identical, except for the one at the very end. Room 13. The door seemed to breathe. It swelled and contracted, as if something inside was pressing against it, waiting. A whisper slithered through the silence, her name spoken softly with a voice that wasn't hers. She turned to run, but the hallway stretched endlessly, the walls narrowing as if closing in on her. Then, a hand, pale and withered, shot out from beneath the door, grasping at her ankle. Aurora jolted awake, gasping. Her skin was slick with sweat. The room was still, except for the rhythmic beeping of a monitor down the hall. The nightmare felt real, too real. She sat up, rubbing her temples. That room. Why did it feel familiar? A rustling sound near the door made her stiffen. She turned and saw a figure lingering in the hallway. Matteo, the patient from earlier. He was whispering something to himself, rocking slightly on his heels. Then, without warning, he turned sharply to face her. His eyes were too wide, too dark. "The room knows you," he said. His voice was almost reverent, almost afraid. Aurora shivered. What are you talking about? Mateo took a step closer, lowering his voice. You were here before, but they don't want you to remember. Before she could respond, a nurse appeared, gently pulling him away. Back to your room, Mateo, she said firmly. He went without resisting, but not before whispering, It's watching. Aurora swallowed hard. She didn't know what scared her more, the fact that he sounded insane, or the sinking feeling that he might be right. Aurora didn't sleep after that. She sat curled up on the bed, hugging her knees, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. The voice, the reflection, the smile. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. By morning, the rational part of her took control. She needed answers. When the nurses came to do their rounds, she acted normal. If she started asking about things that didn't make sense, they might keep her here longer. She needed to be careful. At breakfast, she found Mateo sitting alone, his tray untouched. His fingers drummed anxiously on the table. I saw something last night, she murmured, sitting across from him. Outside my window. Mateo's gaze snapped to hers. It knows you remember. A chill ran through her. I don't remember anything. You will. He leaned in, voice low. It leaves traces. Aurora frowned. Traces? Instead of answering, Mateo grabbed a plastic fork and scratched something into the table. 13. That number again. Aurora's pulse quickened. She needed proof, something real to hold on to. She slipped away from the common area and made her way toward the records office. The door was unlocked. Inside, rows of filing cabinets loomed in the dim light. She scanned the labels. Patient records, 2012 to present. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the files, searching for her name. Nothing. Not in this section. Not in the older files. It was like she had never been admitted here at all. But just as she was about to give up, her eyes landed on something strange. At the bottom of a drawer, beneath a stack of folders, someone had scratched a name into the metal surface. Aurora. She traced the letters with her fingers. The grooves were deep, jagged, as if someone had carved it in a hurry. The air in the room felt heavier. Somewhere behind her, the floor creaked. She wasn't alone. Aurora's breath hitched. The room was silent, but she felt it, a presence. Slowly she turned. Nothing. The records office was empty. The hallway beyond was dim, the overhead lights buzzing softly, but the feeling lingered. She exhaled shakily and closed the drawer, shoving the panic down. She needed to get out of here. Back in the common area, the morning routine was continuing as usual. Patients mumbling to themselves, nurses passing out medication. But something was off. Mateo's chair was empty. Her stomach tightened. She scanned the room, her pulse quickening. He was just here. A nurse walked past, and Aurora caught her arm. Where's Mateo? The woman blinked at her. Who? Aurora frowned. Mateo, dark hair. He was here at breakfast. I think you're mistaken, the nurse said. Her tone clipped. There's no patient by that name. Aurora's skin went cold. Number that wasn't possible. She turned, searching the room. A few patients glanced at her dully, uninterested. No one reacted. No one seemed to notice that someone was missing. Her gaze landed on Mateo's usual seat. His breakfast tray was still there, untouched. Slowly, she walked to it. A single fork lay beside the plate, and her breath hitched when she saw what was scratched into the table beneath it. He saw me. Aurora's pulse thundered in her ears. The nurses said he never existed, but she had spoken to him, sat with him, saw him scratching that damn number into the table. She wasn't losing her mind. Something was erasing him. She needed to find out why. Aurora couldn't shake the feeling that the hospital itself was gaslighting her. Mateo was real. He had to be. She had spoken to him, heard his voice, saw the fear in his eyes, and yet he was gone. Hadn't Dr. Lenhart said amnesia was a response to trauma? What if Mateo hadn't disappeared? What if she was simply forgetting? She needed help. The only person who ever seemed remotely sympathetic was Nurse Mariana. Aurora found her near the nurse's station, flipping through patient charts. She hesitated before speaking. Mateo is missing. Mariana's fingers froze over the pages. For a fraction of a second, she didn't breathe. Then she forced a polite smile. Who? Aurora's stomach twisted. Not her too. You know who? Aurora pressed. He was here this morning. We talked. We ate breakfast together. He scratched something into the table. Aurora. You saw him, didn't you? Mariana glanced around before grabbing Aurora's wrist, pulling her into a small supply closet. She exhaled, rubbing a hand down her face. You need to stop asking questions. Aurora's pulse pounded. Why? Because I might actually get an answer. Mariana looked at her for a long moment. Then she sighed. You were here before. Aurora's mouth went dry. What? I shouldn't be telling you this, Mariana whispered. But She exhaled. I remember you from before. Aurora's chest tightened. I started working here 10 years ago. You were here then. Mariana swallowed. You were just a little girl. A sickening wave of dizziness washed over her. 10 years ago. How was that possible? Aurora stumbled back, gripping a metal shelf for balance. Her head throbbed, images flashing in quick, disjointed bursts. A long hallway, a door, the number 13, the smell of damp wood and something rotting. A voice, a whisper, a scream. Her vision blurred. Mariana steadied her. It's happening, isn't it? She whispered. Aurora barely heard her, because suddenly the name scratched into the filing cabinet made sense. She had carved it. A long time ago. Aurora barely made it back to her room. Her legs felt weak, her breath uneven. She had been here before. The realization sank its claws into her mind, spreading like ink in water. Why hadn't she remembered? Why had they erased her? She sat on the bed, pressing her palms against her temples. The headache throbbed behind her eyes deeper than before. Mariana had been about to say more, but the look in her eyes, fear, real fear, was enough to silence any questions Aurora might have had. She lay down, hoping sleep might bring clarity. Instead, it brought something else. At first, there was nothing but the usual silence of the hospital at night, the distant murmur of voices, the soft beeping of machines. Then, the breathing, slow, shallow, and it wasn't hers. Aurora's eyes snapped open. The room was dark, the faint glow from the hallway casting long shadows. Something was in the room with her. The weight came next, a slow, creeping pressure, like invisible hands pressing down on her chest. She tried to move. She couldn't. A paralysis, not just of the body, but of the mind, a deep, primal terror rooting her to the bed. The breathing grew louder. It was right above her. She could feel it, hovering inches from her face. A whisper, close enough that the air stirred against her ear. You never should have left. Aurora sat up, gasping for air. The weight was gone. The room was empty, but the door, it had been closed when she lay down. Now it was slightly ajar, as if someone or something had just slipped out. Her hands trembled as she wiped the cold sweat from her face. She needed to get out of this room. She needed to move. The hall was quiet, but the air felt thick, like a storm was pressing against the building. The flickering lights buzzed overhead as she walked. her bare feet silent against the cold linoleum. She didn't know where she was going, only that something was pulling her forward. A voice whispered in her head, "You were here before." She turned a corner and stopped. At the end of the hallway, past the nurse's station, stood room 13. The door was sealed shut, the frame covered in deep scratches, like someone had clawed at it desperately. The paint around the number was worn away, as if people had tried to scrub it off. But it was still there, always there. A cold dread filled her. Matteo had said the room knew her. Mariana had said she'd been here before. So why had no one told her what happened inside? Her fingers twitched at her sides. She had to know. She turned abruptly and hurried back toward the nurse's station. Most of the staff was occupied, their voices murmuring in the distance. Mariana's office was dark, but unlocked. Inside, she found a stack of old patient files. Hands shaking, she flipped through them. Most of the names were unfamiliar. Then, a photograph slipped loose from a folder. It was black and white, grainy. Several children stood in hospital gowns, their faces blurred with age. Aurora's breath caught in her throat, because one of the children in the picture was her. She flipped the photo over. There was a name scrawled in faded ink. Celine. Aurora's stomach dropped. She'd been looking for answers about herself, but this was someone else. Someone tied to room 13. And Aurora had no idea why her own face was in her file. Aurora's hands shook as she held the photograph. Her own face, staring back at her from a moment frozen in time. A child, standing in a hospital gown, surrounded by others who had long since vanished. And a name, Celine. Her pulse thundered. Who was Celine? Why was her picture in this file? And why? Why did the sight of that name make her feel sick? A noise outside made her stiffen. Footsteps. She shoved the photo back into the folder and slipped out of Mariana's office before she could be caught. She didn't stop moving until she reached the end of the hall, until she was standing in front of room 13. The door looked different up close. The scratches were deeper. The air around it was colder than the rest of the hallway, sending a prickle over her skin. A memory stirred. This door. She had been here before. Her fingers hovered over the handle, locked. But as she turned away, it clicked. Aurora froze. Slowly, the door swung open on its own. The room inside was dark. A stale, decaying smell seeped into the hallway. She stepped inside. The air was thick, heavy. Dust clung to every surface. An old hospital bed, a rusting wheelchair. The walls were covered in faded writing, scribbled over and over in uneven letters. Aurora stepped closer, squinting. The words were her name, scrawled over every inch of the walls, as if someone had been trying desperately not to forget her. A tremor ran through her. On the far side of the room, something waited beneath a dust-covered sheet. The shape was too still, too human. A part of her screamed to leave, but her hands were already reaching forward, grasping the edge of the sheet. She ripped it away. A VHS tape lay on the chair beneath it, and written in marker across the plastic casing, Celine. Aurora's fingers trembled as she picked up the VHS tape. The plastic felt wrong, too cold, too heavy, like it had been sitting in this room, waiting for her to find it. The name scrawled across the front, Celine. That name again. Who was she? And why did seeing it make Aurora feel like she couldn't breathe? A shiver crawled down her spine. She needed to watch this. She turned and nearly screamed. Dr. Lenhart stood in the doorway, expressionless, unmoving. Aurora clutched the tape to her chest. You knew. His face remained impassive. What did you find? Her grip tightened. Tell me the truth. I was here before, wasn't I? A pause. Then, the first crack in his composure. Aurora, he said carefully, stepping into the room. You don't understand what you're doing. She backed away. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. I remember this place, she whispered. I remember the hallway, the door, the feeling that something was watching. Lenhart exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. We tried to help you. A bitter laugh escaped her. By erasing me. He didn't answer. Aurora took another step back. Her foot hit something solid. The chair, the old TV sitting in the corner, the TV, the VHS. The answers were here. She slammed the tape into the player. The screen flickered. Static. A long, droning hum. Then, the image of a little girl. Aurora's breath hitched. She knew that face. It was her. The grainy footage showed her younger self, sitting in this very room, whispering to something just outside the frame. Then, without warning, her small head snapped toward the camera. Aurora's body went rigid. The girl on the screen, her younger self, was looking straight at her. And then, in a hollow, empty voice, "You shouldn't have come back." The TV screen exploded in static. And behind her, the air turned ice cold. Something was here. Something was waiting. Something had been waiting for a long, long time.